There are stories the old folks in the Ozarks will tell you for the price of a glass of whiskey. There are stories they'll tell you for nothing, just to get them out of their mouths. And then there are the stories you cannot pay them to tell at all. Stories they will not speak of after dark, will not write down, will not pass to their own grandchildren, because some words, once spoken, do not stay where you put them. This is one of those stories. Before I take you down into it, do me a small favor. Look at the description of this video. There's a link pinned in the comments too. It leads to something I've been working on for a long time. The APPALACHIAN dossier, a collection of cases, depositions, and letters erased from official American records between 1843 and 1891. The kind of files that were not lost by accident. The kind that were buried because someone, somewhere, decided you weren't supposed to read them. If tonight's account interests you, that's where the deeper rot lives. The link is there. Read it when the lights are still on. Now, settle in. Before I get started, I want to ask you something. From wherever you're listening, from whatever room or car or kitchen you're sitting in tonight, drop a comment and tell me where you are. I want to know who's out there. The Ozarks reach further than people think. The cold that lives in them reaches further still. The year is 1847. The place is a stretch of timber and limestone in what they used to call the Boston Mountains, deep in the northwest corner of Arkansas. There were no proper roads then. There were game trails widened by mules. There were creek beds that doubled as wagon paths in summer and froze into glass ribbons in winter. The county seat was 3 days' ride away in good weather, and good weather, they used to say, was a guest you could not depend on. In a small holler, tucked between two ridges, sat a settlement called Pemrick's Bend. It is not on any map you'll find now. It is not in any state register. The county clerk's office in Fayetteville had a single page on it once. That page was removed sometime around 1862 and was never returned to the archive. I have asked. Others have asked. Pemrick's Bend held maybe 40 souls. A grist mill. A blacksmith. A 2-room building that served as a meeting house on Sundays and a schoolhouse on weekdays for the older youths who could be spared from the fields. There was a general store run by a man named Caspian Olmark, who had come down from Ohio after the death of his first wife and had built the store out of split oak with his own hands. There was a tavern of sorts, though no one called it that out loud. The Methodist circuit rider would have skinned them if they had. The story begins, as most of these stories do, with a question that should never have been asked. His name was Tobias Vermo. He was 31 years old in the spring of 1847, a widower of 2 years, a surveyor by trade, hired by a land speculation outfit out of St. Louis to walk the ridges south of Pemrick's Bend and mark the timber. He was a tall man, not especially heavy, with the long stride of someone used to walking 8 or 9 hours at a stretch. His hair was the dark red of old brick. His left hand was missing the last 2 joints of the ring finger, which he had lost to a chain harrow as a boy in Pennsylvania, and which he never spoke of unless asked direct. He came into Pemrick's Bend on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. He took a room at a widow's house at the end of the lane, a 2-story clapboard, owned by a woman named Hespera Malden, who was 63 and had buried 2 husbands and a brother, and who did not, as a rule, like surveyors. She let the room to him because the speculation company paid her in silver up front, and silver, she said, did not care what trade a man was in. For the first week, nothing happened. He walked the southern ridges in the daylight. He came back at dusk. He ate the cornbread and salt pork Hespera left for him on the table by the door. He wrote in his field journal by a tallow candle. He slept. It was on the 8th night that he heard the singing. He thought at first it was a woman in another part of the house. The voice was low and not unpleasant, and the words were in a tongue he could not place. He sat up in bed and listened. The candle was out. The house was full of that particular Ozark dark, which has a weight to it, the kind of dark that seems to lean against the windows from outside. The voice was coming from outside. It was coming from the woods. He went to the window. The moon was a thin curl, not enough to see by. The voice continued, neither louder nor quieter, neither nearer nor farther. He could not have said how long he stood there. When he finally went back to bed, the singing stopped at the exact moment his head touched the pillow, not a moment before, not a moment after. In the morning he asked Hespera about it. She did not answer right away. She poured him coffee. She sat down across the table from him with her own cup. She watched him over the rim of it with the kind of look an old woman gives a man who has just done something foolish without knowing he has done it. "Mr. Vermoila," she said, "do you know what holler this is?" He said he did. He said it was Pemrick's Bend. She said no. She said Pemrick's Bend was the settlement. The holler was something older. The holler had a name, she said, that nobody used in daylight and nobody used at night, and that the only people who ever spoke it out loud were the dying and the lost. She said the Cherokee had a word for it before they were marched out, and the word was something like Uskoli, which meant a place where the air does not move properly. She said the Osage had refused to set foot in it long before the Cherokee came. She said her own grandmother had warned her, when she was a girl, never to whistle in the holler, never to call out a name in the holler, and never under any circumstance to answer if she heard her own name called back. Tobias Vermoila did what most 31-year-old surveyors from Pennsylvania would have done. He smiled politely. He thanked her for the coffee. He went out to walk the southern ridges. That night the singing came again. This time it had words he could understand. They were in English. They were his name. Now, before I take you any deeper, let me say this plain. I have been reading about the Hollow Hag of Arkansas, on and off, for the better part of 15 years. I have driven up into that country twice. I have spoken with old men who claim their grandfathers spoke with men who saw her. I have read 3 separate accounts written by 3 separate hands in 3 separate decades, and the accounts agree on details no one ever published. They agree on the singing, they agree on the smell, they agree on what she does to dogs. If you've ever had a moment in your own life where you just knew, that something you could not see was paying close attention to you, drop a comment and tell me about it. Don't tell me you imagined it. I'm not asking that. I'm asking when you knew. Tobias Vermoila wrote down in his field journal that he had heard a woman calling his given name from the woods. He wrote it down in a hand that was, by his own admission later, unsteady. He wrote that he had not answered. He wrote that, in the morning, he was going to ask Caspian Olmark at the general store about it, because Hespera Malden had been less than forthcoming, and he did not like the feeling of being told a thing without being told the whole of the thing. He went to the store the next morning. Caspian Olmark was 44 years old, a thin man with a thinner mustache, who wore wire spectacles that had been mended at the bridge with copper wire. He listened to Tobias for a long time without speaking. When Tobias finished, Caspian closed the door of the store and turned the bolt. Then he sat down on a barrel of nails and told Tobias the story. It went back, he said, to the 1770s. There had been a woman who lived alone in the holler before the settlement was built. Nobody knew where she had come from. She was not Cherokee. She was not Osage. She was not French or Scotch-Irish or any of the other peoples who had made their way into that country. Her skin was the color of birchwood. Her hair was the color of wet ash. She did not speak any language anyone could identify, but she could understand whatever was said to her, and she could answer in your own tongue if she chose to, in a voice that came out of her throat as if it had been waiting there a long time to be used. The first hunters who came through called her the Gray Woman. The next called her the Holler Woman. By the time the settlers built the grist mill in 1798, she was being called the Hollow Hag, and the name had stuck because by then people had stopped seeing her as anything resembling a woman at all. She was not a witch, Caspian said. She was older than witches. She did not curse the settlers exactly. The settlers cursed themselves by what they did to her in the autumn of 1793. I'm not going to tell you what they did. The records do not say plainly, and the records that do exist, as I mentioned, were removed. What I will say is this. A group of men from Pemrick's Bend, 12 in total, went up into the holler one night with torches and rope. They came back at dawn. The next morning the eldest of those 12, a man named Obadiah Pemrick himself, the founder of the settlement, walked out of his own front door and into the river and was never found. Within the year, all 12 were dead, 2 of accidents, 3 of fevers, 3 of what the country doctor called melancholy madness. The last 4 were found in their beds, eyes open, mouths open, and, by every account that survived, none of them appeared to have struggled. They appeared, the doctor wrote, to have been waiting. After that, the holler changed. Animals would not enter it. Dogs that wandered in came back without their tongues. Horses would refuse to cross the creek that fed the holler from the south. Birds did not nest in the timber on the holler side ridge. The weather inside the holler was wrong. It would rain in the holler when it was clear in Pemrick's Bend. It would be still in the holler when the ridges around it were lashed by wind. And the singing started. The singing was hers. It was not constant. It came in spells. Years could pass without anyone hearing her. Then, for reasons no one ever understood, she would begin to sing again, and the singing would last for a season. And during that season, certain people in the settlement would begin to dream. They would dream the same dream. They would dream of walking up into the holler at night, of finding a door at the foot of a sycamore tree, of opening that door, and of going down into a place that was not exactly under the ground. The ones who could resist the dream lived. The ones who could not did not. Caspian Olmark looked at Tobias across the barrel of nails and said, "She's been singing for 3 weeks now. You are the first stranger she has called by name." Tobias asked the question that, looking back, he should never have asked. He asked what would happen if he answered her. Caspian Olmark stood up from the barrel and unbolted the door of the store and held it open. He did not look at Tobias when he spoke. He looked at the road outside. "You won't have to answer her," he said. "Eventually she will sing the question that you cannot help but answer. That is how she works. Pack your things, Mr. Vermeulen. Ride east at first light. Do not come back through this country. Do not write to anyone here. Do not tell anyone where you have been. If she has your name, she may try to follow it. Names are how she travels." Tobias did not ride east at first light. He told himself he was a rational man. He told himself this was Ozark superstition, the same kind of thing his Pennsylvania grandmother had warned him about with regard to thunder on a Friday and bread baked during a funeral. He told himself the singing was a woman in the woods, a real woman, perhaps a recluse, perhaps a moonshiner's wife, perhaps someone with troubles of her own. He told himself he had a job to finish. He went back up onto the southern ridge that day. And here is where the field journal becomes, in places, very difficult to read. The handwriting deteriorates. There are gaps. There are pages that have been torn out and pages that have been written over in a different hand entirely, which is impossible, because the journal was found locked in his trunk in Hespera Muldean's spare room, and the trunk was not opened until 2 months later, and the second hand belongs to a man who, by every account, was already dead by the time those entries were written. But I'm getting ahead. On that day, on the southern ridge, Tobias wrote that the woods felt full. Those were his words. The woods felt full. He did not see anyone. He did not hear anything. But the woods, he wrote, felt full, the way a church feels full a moment before the service begins. He wrote that the temperature dropped sharply in a particular hollow he had to cross by perhaps 15 degrees in the space of about 30 paces, and rose again on the other side. He wrote that his pocket compass spun. He wrote that he felt distinctly and without ambiguity that someone was walking behind him. When he turned, there was no one. When he turned back, the sense of being followed resumed. He came down off the ridge an hour earlier than he had planned. That evening, while we are still in this part of the story, I want to remind you that this account is being told to you by Macabre Story. If you are enjoying it, please subscribe to the channel. We work hard on these. If you are listening to this somewhere other than Macabre Story, on some other channel that has re-uploaded our work without our permission, please report it to us. We have lost more nights of sleep over stolen content than I care to admit. Now, that evening, Hespera Malden was not in the house when Tobias returned. The fire in the kitchen hearth was banked but cold. There was a note on the table. It was written in a careful schoolhouse hand. It said, "Gone to my sister at Cane Creek. Do not wait for me. Bolt the door." Tobias bolted the door. He sat at the kitchen table with his field journal open in front of him. He tried to write. He could not. He listened to the house settle. Old houses in the Ozarks settle differently than houses in Pennsylvania. The wood is greener, the nails are softer, the sounds are a kind of breathing. At some point, and he could not say when, the singing began. It was closer than it had been on the previous nights. It was not in the woods. It was at the edge of the yard, just past the rail fence, where the apple tree stood. The voice was low. The words were his name. Tobias, Tobias Vermo, Tobias. And then, after a long pause in the same voice but pitched a little softer, a question. The question was not in English, but he understood it. He wrote down, later, that he understood it the way you understand a thing in a dream, which is to say, completely and without any sense that translation has occurred. The question was, "Will you come and see what they did to me?" He sat at the table with his pen frozen above the page. He did not move. The singing did not stop. The question came again. "Will you come and see what they did to me?" And again, "Will you come and see what they did to me?" And he understood with a perfect cold clarity that the question would keep coming all night, every night, until he answered it. He understood that he could leave Pemrick's Bend at first light. He understood he could ride east, as Caspian Olmark had told him to. But he understood also that the question would follow him, because she had his name now, because names are how she travels. He answered. He said out loud to the empty kitchen, "Yes." The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, he heard the apple tree creak, the way an old tree creaks when something heavy has just stepped down out of it. He heard footsteps cross the yard. He heard the rail of the fence creak as a weight shifted onto it. He did not hear the footsteps come up to the house. There was a long stretch of quiet, perhaps a minute, perhaps 3. Then, very softly, there was a knock at the door. He did not open it. The knock came again, softer. Then, in a voice that was Hespera Malden's voice exactly, the voice on the other side of the door said, "Tobias, dear, I came back early. Will you let me in?" He did not move. The voice said, "Tobias, I have the key, but I would rather you opened it." He sat at the table with his hand on the field journal and his eyes on the door. He understood that the voice was not Hespera Malden. He understood that Hespera Malden was not coming back tonight. He understood that whatever was on the other side of the door wanted him to do with his own hand the small, simple thing of lifting a bolt. He did not lift the bolt. After a long while, the voice on the other side of the door said, in a tone that was no longer Hespera's, in a tone that was lower and older and not quite human, "I will come back. We have time." The footsteps left the porch. Tobias sat at the table until the candle burned down. He sat there until the gray came up at the windows. When he could see his own hands in the early light, he stood, and he packed his trunk, and he saddled his horse in the lean-to, and he rode out of Pemrick's Bend without speaking to a single soul. He did not go east, he went south. This is the first thing about his story that no one has ever been able to explain. The road east, the safe road, the road Caspian Olmark had told him to take, was clearly the way back to St. Louis and the speculation company, and the rest of his life. The road south led only deeper into the Boston Mountains. It led toward country that was not even fully mapped. It led toward, if you followed it long enough, the Arkansas River. And beyond that, nothing but more ridges, more timber, more holler, all the way down into the Ouachitas. He went south. The field journal entry from that morning, the last one written in his own clear hand, says only this: "I do not know why I am taking this road. My horse refuses the Eastern Fork. I have tried 3 times. He will not go. I do not have the strength to fight him." For the next 11 days, the field journal entries are short and increasingly disjointed. Camped by a creek. Did not sleep. Heard her. Crossed a ridge today that was not on any map. The compass would not settle. A man on the trail. He spoke to me in English. He was not real. I knew he was not real because his shadow fell the wrong way. He told me to keep going south. The horse will not eat. I dreamed of the door at the foot of the sycamore tree. She was in the dream. She was not as old as I had been told. She was not a hag. She was very tired. She asked me if I would carry something for her. I said yes again. I should not have said yes again. The horse died this morning. I am walking now. I do not know what day it is. I do not know how long I have been walking. The sycamore tree is real. I have seen it twice today. It is not in the same place. That is the last entry written in the hand of Tobias Vermo. The next entry, dated 5 days later, is in a different hand altogether. It is in the hand of a man named Wendell Garrick, who was a circuit-riding preacher of the Hardshell Baptist persuasion, and who, according to the records of his denomination, had been thrown from his horse and killed in 1843, 4 years before Tobias Vermo set foot in Arkansas. The entry, in Wendell Garrick's hand, says this: "He has come to the door. He is opening it. He does not understand that the door opens both ways. I have tried to warn him. My voice does not carry where he is. May the Lord have mercy on his soul and on hers, and on whatever comes through behind him." 2 months after Tobias Vermo rode out of Pemrick's Bend, his trunk was opened in Hespera, a Malden's spare room. The trunk was opened by a deputy from the county seat, a man named Quintus Halverstead, who had been sent to look into the disappearance after the speculation company in St. Louis began to ask questions. The journal was inside the trunk. The journal had been inside the trunk for 2 months. The trunk had been locked. The key had been on Hespera's mantelpiece the entire time. The journal contained entries dated after the trunk was last opened. Quintus Halverstead read the journal. He copied portions of it into his official report, which is, as I said, the report that was removed from the county records around 1862. Before it was removed, however, a young clerk at the courthouse made an unauthorized copy. That copy passed through several hands over the next 60 years. It is the source for most of what I am telling you tonight. But I want to tell you what happened next in Pemrick's Bend, because the story does not end with Tobias Vermo. The story, in some ways, only began with him. In the autumn of 1847, the singing in the holler grew worse. It was no longer confined to the holler itself. People began to hear it in the settlement. They began to hear it in their own houses, just on the other side of the certain walls, in the voices of dead relatives who had died long enough ago that there should have been no living memory of how they sounded. Caspian Olmark, the storekeeper, woke one night to the voice of his first wife, who had died in Ohio 15 years earlier, calling him from the small porch behind the store. He did not open the door. He nailed it shut the next morning, and he never used that door again for the rest of his life. A young couple named Jorik and Wynette Pradlow, who had been married only the previous spring and were the youngest adult couple in the settlement at 22 and 20, respectively, began to dream. They dreamed the dream that Caspian had warned Tobias about. They dreamed of the door at the foot of the sycamore tree. They dreamed of going down. Wynette woke one night and found Jorik was not in the bed beside her. He was standing at the window, fully dressed, with his boots on. He was not awake. He was looking out at the apple tree in the side yard. When she touched his shoulder, he turned to her and said, in a voice that was his and was not his, "She wants to know if you'll come, too." Then he came back to himself and remembered nothing. They left Pemrick's Bend within the week. They settled in Missouri. Wynette lived to be 89. Jorik died at 34, in his sleep, with his eyes open and his mouth open, in a manner that the country doctor said reminded him very much of cases he had heard about in Arkansas, in his youth, that he did not care to discuss further. Hespera Malden came back from Cane Creek in early November. She had been gone almost 6 months. She did not explain her absence. When Quintus Halverstead asked her about Tobias Vermo, she said only that he had paid in silver, and that silver did not care what trade a man was in. She would not say more. She lived another 9 years. She is buried in the small graveyard on the rise above where Pemrick's Bend used to stand. Her stone gives only her name and her dates. There is no inscription. Local tradition, such as it is, holds that she requested no inscription, because she did not want anything written about her that might be read aloud. That, by the way, is the rule in that country even now. You do not read aloud the names on old stones. You do not call out unfamiliar names in the woods. And if you hear your own name from a place where no one should know it, you do not answer. The settlement of Pemrick's Bend was abandoned by 1863. The official reason, in the county histories that survived, was the war. The men had gone off to fight on both sides, and few had come back, and the women and the older folks had drifted to other settlements with kin. That is the reason that was written down. The reason that was not written down, but that was passed in the way these things are passed, was that the singing had gotten into the houses by then, and the houses no longer felt like houses. The grist mill was the last building to fall. It stood until 1891. A man named Ferris Olcom, who was not from the holler, but who had bought the mill from the heirs of the Pemrick family, lived alone in the miller's cottage attached to it for the better part of a decade. He was, by all accounts, a stubborn man, a free thinker, a subscriber to several Boston magazines, a man who had no patience for what he called the woodland mythology of the region. He kept a journal of his own. The journal survives. It is held in a private collection in Little Rock. I have not been permitted to see it, though I have spoken with 2 researchers who have, and they have told me, in confidence, what its final pages contain. The final pages of Ferris Olcom's journal describe, in increasingly fragmented prose, a season in 1890 in which he heard the singing for the first time. He had lived in the holler for 9 years without hearing it. He had begun to think the local stories were the inventions of a credulous people. Then, in the August of 1890, he heard her. The 2 researchers I spoke to both told me that the final entries describe a courtship. That is the word both of them used independently. A courtship. Ferris Olcom wrote that she came every night, and that her singing was, by his own description, lovely, and that the question she was asking was not the question she had asked Tobias Vermo. The question she asked Ferris Olcom was something else. Neither researcher would tell me what the question was. One of them told me she stopped reading the journal at that point and refused, on the advice of her own grandmother, to read further. Ferris Olcom was found dead in the miller's cottage in March of 1891. The cottage was locked from the inside. The bolt was thrown. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign of struggle. He was sitting at his desk, in his shirt sleeves, with his pen still in his hand. His eyes were open. His mouth was open. The country doctor wrote in his report that the deceased appeared to have been waiting. That is the same phrase the country doctor of 1847 had used, almost word for word. 44 years apart. Two different doctors, the same phrase. There are two other accounts from the years between Tobias Vermo and Ferris Olcom that I want to put on the record here because they are part of the pattern and because they have not, as far as I know, been told together in one place before. The first is from 1853, 6 years after Tobias rode south. A traveling daguerreotypist by the name of Phineas Sallow had come down through the Ozarks taking portraits of farm families for 50 cents a plate. He was a small man, no more than 5.5 feet tall, with weak lungs and a chronic cough, and he carried his apparatus in a wagon drawn by a tired bay mare. He had heard, somewhere along his route, that there was a half-abandoned holler where the abandoned mill might make a striking subject for a series of plates he wanted to sell to a publisher in Cincinnati. He came into Pemrick's Bend on a hot August evening. The settlement was already in decline by then. Caspian Olmark was still running the store, though only on Tuesdays and Fridays. Hespera Malden had been dead 2 years. The boarding house had been bought by a niece who had no use for it and had let it go to weeds. Phineas Sallow took 5 plates that day. 3 are lost. 2 survive, in a private archive I have visited twice, and from which I have been permitted to take handwritten notes, but no photographs. The first surviving plate shows the grist mill from the south with the creek in the foreground in the late afternoon light. It is a competent photograph. There is nothing remarkable in it except perhaps the quality of the silence the image conveys, which the eye reads even in a black and white plate. The second surviving plate is the one that the archive has, more than once, considered destroying. It is also of the mill. It is taken from a slightly different angle, perhaps 30 paces to the east of the first. The exposure is longer. Daguerreotypes of that period required several seconds of stillness, sometimes as much as a minute, depending on the light. In the second plate, the mill is the same, the creek is the same, the trees are the same. But standing at the edge of the timber, half in shadow, is the figure of a tall woman. She is not in the first plate. The 2 plates were taken, according to Phineas Sallow's own notebook, less than 10 minutes apart. The figure in the second plate is described by every researcher who has examined it in nearly identical terms. She is tall. She is dressed in something that is neither a dress nor a robe, something that looks more like a wrapping of long gray cloth. Her hair is loose and falls past her waist. Her face cannot be made out clearly. The exposure has rendered her face as a kind of long, pale smear, but the smear is wrong somehow. Longer than a face should be, as if her face were pulled forward toward the camera the way a moth is pulled toward a flame. Phineas Sallow did not see her when he took the plate. He saw her when he developed it 3 days later in a room he had rented in a town 50 miles to the east. He wrote in his notebook that he sat looking at the plate for what felt like an hour, and that during that hour the room around him became very cold, and that he heard, very faintly, the sound of a woman singing from somewhere outside the window. He did not look out the window. He packed his apparatus that night and rode east at first light. He never returned to the Ozarks. He died of consumption in 1856 in a boarding house in Lexington, Kentucky. The notebook was found among his things by his sister, who could make no sense of it, and who eventually sold it, along with the plates, to a collector of curiosities. The collector wrote, in a letter to a friend, that he kept the plates in a drawer wrapped in black cloth, and that he did not look at them more than once a year, and that on the occasions when he did look at them, he made certain that the door of the room was open and that someone else was in the house. That collection passed through 3 more hands before it came to rest in the archive in Little Rock. The plates are still there. The figure is still in the second plate. The second account I want to give you is from 1879. By 1879, Pemrick's Bend was effectively gone. The grist mill still stood, although it was no longer running. Ferris Olcom had not yet bought it. The miller's cottage was empty. The general store had been pulled down for its lumber. The boarding house had collapsed in a hard winter, and what remained of it had been carried off by scavengers. The schoolhouse and meeting house was used, on rare occasions, by passing circuit preachers, but no congregation gathered there regularly. In the autumn of that year, a survey party from the United States Army Corps of Engineers passed through. They were mapping the watersheds of the Boston Mountains in connection with a proposed federal land use study. There were 6 men in the party. Their leader was a captain by the name of Roderick Maven Ortelius Halpenny, an unusual man with an unusual name, who had served in the Mexican War, and who was, by his own admission in the letters he wrote to his wife, a religious skeptic and a hard rationalist of the New England variety. The party camped one night at the south end of the holler, near the foundation stones of what had been the grist mill. Captain Halpenny's letter to his wife, dated 3 weeks after the encounter, is preserved in the archives of the Army Corps of Engineers and was not classified, only filed in a way that made it almost impossible to find for nearly 100 years. A doctoral student at the University of Arkansas located it in 1986. She wrote her dissertation on the geographical anomalies of 19th-century Ozarks survey records, and her dissertation, while never published commercially, is available through interlibrary loan to any reader who knows to ask for it. The letter says that on the second night in the holler, all 6 men in the survey party heard the singing. Captain Halpenny, the rationalist, the skeptic, attempted to dismiss it as a hoax. He believed that a local resident was attempting to drive them out of the area for reasons connected to the proposed land use study. He took 2 of his men and went out into the dark with a lantern in the direction the singing seemed to be coming from. They walked for about a quarter of a mile. The singing did not get louder as they walked. It did not get softer. It seemed to remain at exactly the same distance from them, no matter how far they went. The captain noted this and wrote it down later as the first detail that began to shake his confidence in the hoax theory. When they had gone perhaps half a mile, they came to a sycamore tree. The captain wrote that the tree was very old and very large, larger than any sycamore he had seen before in his life. He wrote that the trunk at the base was perhaps 15 feet in diameter, although he acknowledged that he had not measured it and might have been mistaken in the dark. He wrote that he held up his lantern, and that the lantern's light, instead of falling on the trunk in the way that lantern light should fall on tree bark, seemed to be drawn into the trunk, as if the trunk were drinking it. He wrote that there was a door at the foot of the sycamore tree. The door was small. It was perhaps 4 feet high. It was made of dark wood, banded with iron, and set into the base of the trunk in a way that the captain could not initially make sense of, because the trunk continued past the door on both sides without any indication that the door was a hole or an opening. The door simply was, embedded in the wood, the way an old anchor might become embedded in the hull of a wreck. The 2 men with the captain were a corporal named Wallace Penny and a private named Esau Cobbett. The corporal, who had grown up in the Carolinas, took one look at the door and turned and walked back the way they had come without speaking. He did not stop walking until he reached the camp. He sat down by the fire and did not speak again that night, and when the morning came, he had aged. His hair, which had been brown the day before, was streaked with white at the temples. He resigned from the Corps of Engineers 2 months later and went home to North Carolina and lived another 40 years and never spoke a word about the holler to anyone who asked. The private Esau Cobbett was less fortunate. He was the youngest of the party, 23 years old, and he was, the captain wrote, the kind of young man whose curiosity was a kind of recklessness. He stepped forward toward the door before the captain could stop him. He put his hand on the iron handle. The captain wrote that he himself was paralyzed in that moment by a feeling that he could not later describe except to say that it was the feeling a man has when he is dreaming of falling and cannot wake himself. The private opened the door. The captain wrote in the letter to his wife that he could not bring himself to describe what he saw beyond the door. He wrote only that what was beyond the door was not a hollow space inside the trunk of the tree. He wrote that what was beyond the door was a long stairway going down, and that the stairway did not end, and that the air rising up out of the doorway was very cold, and that it smelled of stone and of old water and of something else, something he had only smelled once before in his life, in a battlefield hospital in Mexico, after a particular kind of wound. The private went down the stairs. He went down willingly. He went down without looking back. The captain wrote that he, the captain, called the private's name 3 times, and that the private did not turn, and that on the third call the door of the sycamore tree closed by itself, with a sound like a large book being shut. When the captain put his lantern up to the trunk, the door was no longer there. He stood there in the dark for a long time. He wrote that he was not sure how long. When he finally walked back to camp, dawn was breaking. The corporal was sitting by the fire, white-templed and silent. The other 3 men of the party were asleep. The captain told them in the morning that the private had deserted in the night. He filed the report. The report stood. Esau Cobbett was listed as a deserter on the official record of the Corps of Engineers, and his pension and his back pay were forfeited. And his mother in Tennessee, who had lost her husband in the Mexican War, lost her son a second time, this time without a body to bury. Captain Halpenny resigned his commission within a year. He moved his wife from New Hampshire to a small town in central Pennsylvania. He never traveled west of the Susquehanna again. He outlived his wife by 3 years, and during those 3 years his housekeeper reported that he no longer slept in his bedroom, but in a chair in the parlor with the lamp on, and with the door to the parlor bolted from the inside. He died in his sleep in 1894. The housekeeper found him with his eyes open and his mouth open. The country doctor wrote in his report that the deceased appeared to have been waiting 3 doctors. The same phrase, across half a century, across more than 1,000 miles. Captain Halpenny had not been in Arkansas for 15 years when he died. The phrase followed him. Names are how she travels. Stories are how she travels. Phrases written down by country doctors are, perhaps, also how she travels. I have begun to be careful about which phrases I repeat. I have not used the doctor's exact phrase 3 times in a row in this telling, although I came close. You will not hear it from me a 4th time tonight. I want to come back, before I close this story, to the question of what happens to the people whose names she has. There is a pattern in the records. Once you understand the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Tobias Vermo was never found. There is no grave for him. There is no body. The speculation company in St. Louis closed his account in 1849 and wrote off his salary and his survey notes as a loss. His widow's parents, who had been raising him out of charity since his wife died, never heard from him again. He was 31 years old when he walked south out of Pemrick's Bend. He has been gone now for almost 180 years. But here is the part that the records do not explain. In 1873, a hunter in the Ouachita Mountains, almost 200 miles south of Pemrick's Bend, reported being approached at his campfire by a tall man in a surveyor's coat. The man had dark red hair. The man was missing the last 2 joints of his ring finger on his left hand. The man asked him, in a perfectly polite voice, whether he had ever heard a woman singing in the woods. When the hunter said no, the man nodded as if this was the answer he had expected, and walked back into the dark. In 1904, a railroad surveyor working a line through the Boston Mountains, less than 30 miles from where Pemrick's Bend used to stand, reported the same encounter. Tall man, surveyor's coat, dark red hair, missing fingertip. Same question, same nod. when the answer was no. The railroad surveyor was a man named Eustace Carnival, and he was not the kind of man who made things up. He resigned his position within the week and never spoke of it publicly. But he did write a letter to his brother in Cincinnati, and the letter survives. In 1948, a hiker in what is now the Ozark National Forest reported the encounter again. Tall man, surveyor's coat. The clothes, the hiker said, were old, older than they should have been. He thought at first the man was a reenactor of some kind. The man asked if he had heard any singing. The hiker, who had grown up in northern Arkansas, said that he had not, and added, almost without thinking, that he hoped he never would. The tall man nodded. Then, for the first time in any of the recorded encounters, the tall man said something more. He said, "If you do not answer, no matter what she calls you, no matter how kindly she sings, do not answer. There are worse things than dying. I am one of them now." Then he walked back into the woods. The hiker reported the encounter to a forest ranger the next morning. The forest ranger wrote it down. The report exists. It is not classified. It is simply not indexed, and it sits in a box in a records facility in Russellville, Arkansas, where I have held it in my own hands. The hollow hag of Arkansas is still there. People in the area today, the older ones, will tell you only that there are parts of the forest you do not go into after dark. They will not tell you why. They will not tell you the name of the holler. They will not tell you the name of the woman who lived there before the settlement, or the name of what she has become. They will tell you, if you press them, that the singing comes back from time to time in seasons that do not have a calendar. They will tell you that the people who hear it should not answer. They will tell you that names are how she travels. And they will tell you, if you press them harder, that the curse does not stay in the holler. It travels in stories. It travels in the saying of the names of the people she has taken. It travels, some of them say, in the listening. If the listener listens too closely and from the wrong kind of quiet and at the wrong time of night. I have probably said the names too many times tonight already. I have been telling these stories for a long time, and I have learned to be careful about which ones I tell and how and when. Tonight, I have told you this one because it has been sitting in me for a while, and because the dossier I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Appalachian dossier, contains documents related to this case that I cannot put on this channel directly. The link is in the description. It is also pinned in the comments. If you want to read the deputy's report, the one that was removed from the county records, I have included a transcribed copy. If you want to read the letter from Eustace Carnival to his brother in Cincinnati, that is in there too. If you want to know what question she asked Ferris Olcom in the autumn of 1890, I have my own theory. I have written it up. I have not told anyone. I will not tell it on this channel. But it is in the dossier for those who want to know. Read it with the lights on. Before I close out, I want to ask you one more thing. If you have ever, in your own life, heard a sound from outside your house that should not have been there, a voice, a singing, a knock at a door no one should have been at, do not tell it to me in the comments. Tell it to someone you trust in person in the daytime. Do not write it down in a place where strangers can read it. I have come to believe, after 15 years on this, that there are stories that travel better than they should, and that the saying of certain things in certain ways is its own small kind of door. If, on the other hand, you have a story from your own family, a grandfather's story, a great-aunt's story, something you were told once and never forgot, from any country, from any year, send it to us. The address is in the description. If it is the right kind of story, it may be one we tell here with your permission and with the names changed where they need to be. Tobias Vermo was 31 years old when he walked south out of Pemrick's Bend in the spring of 1847. He has been walking in some sense ever since. The hunter in 1873 saw him. The railroad surveyor in 1904 saw him. The hiker in 1948 saw him. The pattern, if you graph it on a piece of paper, runs about every 30 to 40 years. The next encounter, by that math, is overdue. If you are walking in the Boston Mountains or anywhere in the Ozarks after dark, and a tall man in an old surveyor's coat steps up to your fire and asks you if you have heard a woman singing in the woods, you tell him no. You tell him you have never heard her. You tell him you do not know her name. You do not say his name, even if you have guessed it. You let him walk back into the dark. And if you hear her after that, if, on the long way home, you hear a voice from the woods that knows your given name and asks you, in a tongue you should not understand but somehow do, a small, simple question that wants only a yes or a no. You do not answer. You do not even shake your head. You walk. Stay with us for the next account. There are more of these. There are too many of these. Until next time, this has been Macabre Story. Sleep well and keep your doors bolted. And if you hear singing tonight from somewhere in your house where there should not be singing, pretend you did not hear.